The candles in the great hall of Ashcombe Manor trembled as the doors slammed open, and every head turned at once. Serafina Voss stood at the top of the marble stairs, her gown the color of dark wine, her eyes fixed on the man standing below her. The music had not even finished its final note before she raised her hand and pointed it directly at him. "Bow lower," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter like a blade through silk. "You may wear his title, but you will never wear his grace. Bow lower, Duke Adrian Colebrook, or leave this hall in shame." Gasps rippled across the crowd, glasses paused halfway to lips. Somewhere near the orchestra, a violin string gave a soft, nervous whine as the musician's hand froze. Nobody in the room breathed. Everyone knew what this moment meant. A duchess had just challenged a duke, in front of 300 guests, on the very night meant to celebrate his new title. Adrian did not flinch. He had expected trouble tonight, though not quite like this. He had known, ever since his father passed and the title fell onto his shoulders like an iron cloak, that some in this world would never accept him. He had grown up far from these halls, in a small house near the coast, where his mother mended clothes and his father worked as a shipping clerk before an unexpected inheritance changed everything. The old families of the region whispered about him constantly. He was the duke who did not belong, the duke born common. And now, at the peak of the room's silence, the harshest of them all, Duchess Serafina Voss, had decided to say aloud what everyone else only murmured behind fans and wine glasses. He looked at her for a long moment. Her chin was lifted, her shoulders squared, every inch of her poised like a queen delivering judgment. But something in her eyes flickered, just barely, a shadow of something deeper than simple cruelty. Adrian noticed it, the way a sailor notices a change in wind before the storm arrives. He stepped forward instead of bowing. The crowd's murmur grew louder, uncertain what he intended. He climbed the first step, then the second, his boots striking the marble with slow, deliberate rhythm. Serafina's eyes widened slightly, though she did not retreat. She had not expected him to approach her directly. She had expected a bow, forced and humiliating, or a stammering excuse, or perhaps an outburst of anger that would confirm every unkind thing she and her circle believed about him. Instead, when Adrian reached the step just below hers, he extended his hand. "My lady," he said, his voice calm enough to carry across the silent hall. "If a bow is what tonight requires, then let it be a bow shared between equals, on the dance floor, where every guest may witness it." Serafina blinked. For a heartbeat, her carefully built composure wavered. This was not part of the challenge she had prepared. She had rehearsed this moment for weeks, imagining the satisfaction of watching him lower his head before the entire hall, imagining the whispers of victory that would follow her family name afterward. She had not imagined him turning her demand into an invitation. "You mistake my meaning, Your Grace," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier bite. "I did not ask you to dance." "And I did not ask you to command me," Adrian replied evenly. Yet here we are, both surprising each other. A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the nearest guests, quickly hushed by sharp glances from the older nobility, who still waited to see how this confrontation would end. Somewhere near the back of the hall, Lady Margaret Ashford, one of the few who had shown Adrian genuine kindness since his arrival, watched with her hand pressed lightly to her chest, silently hoping he would not lose his composure. Serafina's fingers twitched at her side. Every instinct told her to refuse, to turn away, to let the hall witness her contempt rather than any softening. But something about the way he stood there, patient and unshaken, made retreat feel like the greater humiliation. If she pulled away now, the story spreading through the ballroom tomorrow would not be about his failure. It would be about hers. She placed her hand in his. The orchestra, sensing the moment shift, scrambled to recover the thread of the song they had abandoned moments before. The conductor lifted his baton with visible relief, and the violins swelled back into motion, filling the hall with music meant to smooth over the tension still hanging thick in the air. Adrian led her down the final step, onto the polished floor, where other couples quickly parted to give them room. He placed his hand at her waist, and she rested hers upon his shoulder, though her spine remained stiff as iron, refusing to relax, even as the music carried them into the first slow turn. "You did not bow," she said quietly, only for him to hear. "No," he agreed, "but neither did you back down." I imagine that troubles you more than my refusal. Her eyes narrowed. You know nothing about what troubles me. Perhaps not yet, he said, guiding her through the next turn with practiced ease, though he had learned to dance only in the past year, taught by an aging instructor his father had hired before his death. But I intend to learn. She said nothing more for several turns, the silence between them filled only by violins and the soft shuffle of other dancers, slowly returning to the floor, grateful for the excuse to look away from the couple at its center. Serafina studied him from the corner of her eye. He was taller than she remembered from their brief introduction months earlier, his features sharper in the candlelight, his gaze steady in a way that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She had built an image of him in her mind, an image she had clung to for years even before he held any title at all. That image did not match the man currently guiding her across the floor with a calm she found infuriating. The dance ended. Adrian released her hand and offered a small, respectful bow, this one entirely his choice, not her demand. The crowd, uncertain how to respond, offered scattered applause that grew steadier as more guests joined in, relieved that the evening's central drama had ended without disaster. Serafina turned and walked swiftly toward the terrace doors, her skirt sweeping behind her like a retreating storm. Adrian watched her go, aware that many eyes remained fixed on him, waiting to see if he would follow or let her disappear into the night air alone. He followed. The terrace was cooler, lit only by lanterns strung along the stone railing, the noise of the ballroom muffled behind heavy glass doors. Serafina stood near the edge, her hands gripping the railing, staring out at the dark gardens below. She did not turn when she heard his footsteps. You should not have come out here, she said. It will only give them more to talk about. They already have plenty to talk about, Adrian said, stopping a respectful distance away. I doubt my presence here changes much. She let out a short, humorless laugh. You have no idea what changes, and what does not, Your Grace. You have held this title for what? 6 months? A year? 8 months, he said quietly. Long enough to understand that most of this hall would rather see me fail than succeed. Long enough to understand that you, more than anyone, would celebrate that failure. Serafina finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the lantern light. You assume you know why. I have heard the stories, Adrian admitted, about your father, about the ruin that fell upon your family many years ago. I have heard that some blame my family for it. Her jaw tightened. Not some. Everyone who matters. Your father's business dealings with mine ended in disaster. My father lost nearly everything within a single year. Our estate, our standing, our peace, and yours built higher on the wreckage of ours. That is the story you were told, Adrian said carefully, but I do not believe it is the whole truth. You would defend your own family, of course. I am not defending anyone, he said. I am telling you that since I inherited this title, I have spent every spare hour going through my father's old records, trying to understand exactly what happened during those years, because the story never made sense to me either. Pieces are missing, Duchess, important pieces. For the first time that evening, Serafina's composure cracked slightly, just enough for a flicker of uncertainty to show through her anger. What pieces? I am not ready to say, Adrian admitted. Not until I am certain. I do not wish to offer false hope, or worse, present incomplete truths that only cause further harm. But I promise you this. If there is more to what happened to your father, I intend to find it. She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any hint of deception, any flicker of the smugness she had expected from a man recently elevated to a title he had not been raised to hold. She found none, only quiet determination, and something else she could not quite name. Why would you bother? She asked finally. I demanded you bow before the entire hall. I meant to humiliate you. You did not humiliate me, Adrian said. You gave me a chance to show this hall something different. That is worth more to me than your apology, which I suspect will never come. A faint, reluctant almost smile touched the corner of her mouth before she caught herself and smoothed her expression back into careful neutrality. Do not expect one, Your Grace. I would not dream of it, he said, and for the first time that night, there was warmth in his voice rather than caution. They stood together at the railing for a moment longer, the tension between them shifting into something quieter, something neither of them fully understood yet. Below, the garden lay dark and still, hedges trimmed into careful shapes, a fountain trickling softly in the distance. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, then fell silent. Inside the ballroom, the music continued, laughter rising and falling, as the guests slowly returned to their usual gossip and dancing, though many eyes still drifted occasionally toward the terrace doors, wondering what might be happening beyond the glass. Unseen by either of them, near the edge of the garden hedges, a man in a dark coat watched the terrace with sharp, calculating eyes. Lord Callum Reyes had attended tonight's ball for reasons entirely his own, and the sight of Adrian and Serafina standing together, speaking in low, careful voices, was not part of any plan he had considered. He had spent years ensuring that the truth about the Voss family's ruin remained buried, using every connection and favor he had built since that fateful year. If Adrian Colebrook truly intended to dig through old records in search of missing pieces, Reyes would need to know exactly how much the young Duke had already found, and how quickly he intended to find the rest. He turned and slipped quietly back toward the front of the manor, already composing the message he would send before morning. Back on the terrace, Serafina finally stepped away from the railing. "I should return inside," she said, "before my absence becomes its own scandal." "Of course," Adrian said, offering a small nod. She paused at the terrace doors, glancing back at him one final time. "This changes nothing between us, Your Grace." "Perhaps not tonight," Adrian said, "but I do not believe either of us walked away from this evening the same as we arrived." She did not answer, though she did not entirely disagree either. She disappeared back into the golden light of the ballroom, leaving Adrian alone on the terrace with the cool night air and the quiet certainty that whatever came next between them, and whatever secrets still lay buried in his father's old records, tonight had only been the beginning. Morning arrived at Ashcombe Manor, with a gray mist rolling off the hills, and Adrian was already awake before the first servant lit the kitchen fires. He sat in his study, surrounded by stacks of old ledgers, letters bound in fraying ribbon, and a single portrait of his father that watched over the room with quiet, unreadable eyes. Sleep had not come easily after the ball. His mind kept circling back to Serafina's face on the terrace, the flicker of doubt behind her anger, and the question she had not asked, but clearly wanted to. Edmund Hale, his steward and closest aide since childhood, entered with a tray of tea, and found the Duke exactly where he had left him hours earlier. "You did not sleep," Edmund said, setting the tray down carefully among the papers. "I could not," Adrian admitted, rubbing his eyes. "Not after last night." "The entire staff is already talking about the ball," Edmund said. "They say the Duchess Voss demanded you bow, and instead, you danced with her. News travels quickly in this house. News travels quickly everywhere, Your Grace. By tomorrow, half the county will know." Adrian set down the ledger he had been examining, and looked up. "Edmund, I need you to help me trace something. Years ago, before I held this title, my father had dealings with the Voss family. Business dealings that ended, from what I understand, in the ruin of their estate. I need to understand exactly what happened." Edmund's expression shifted, careful and measured. "Your father never spoke of those years easily. Whatever happened, it troubled him greatly." "Then it troubled him for a reason," Adrian said, "and I intend to find out what that reason was." Edmund hesitated before nodding. "I will see what I can locate among the older records. Some of the correspondence from that period may still exist in the archive room, though much of it was never organized properly." "Start there," Adrian said. "And Edmund, keep this quiet for now. I do not want word reaching certain ears before I understand what I am dealing with." "You mean Lord Reyes," Edmund said quietly. Adrian's eyes lifted sharply. "Why would you mention him?" "Because his name appears more than once in the fragments I have already seen, Your Grace. I noticed it weeks ago, while sorting through your father's old business correspondence, though I did not think much of it at the time." A cold, careful stillness settled over Adrian. "Bring me everything you can find, with his name attached, today, if possible." Edmund bowed slightly, and left the study, and Adrian sat alone for a long moment, staring at the portrait of his father, wondering exactly what secrets the old man had carried quietly to his grave. Across the county, in the grand but slowly fading halls of Voss House, Serafina sat before her mirror, while her maid, Charlotte Grant, brushed out her long dark hair in slow, steady strokes. Neither spoke for several minutes. though Charlotte could sense the unusual quiet weighing on her mistress. "You have not said a word about the ball," Charlotte finally ventured. "There is little to say," Serafina replied, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. "The whole staff is saying the Duke refused to bow and danced with you instead. They say it was quite a sight." "It was an embarrassment," Serafina said, though even she could hear how unconvincing the words sounded. Charlotte set down the brush and met her mistress's eyes in the mirror's reflection. "My lady, I have served you for 6 years. I know the difference between your voice when you are embarrassed and your voice when you are unsettled. This sounds like the latter." Serafina sighed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "He said something strange to me, Charlotte. He said there were missing pieces in what happened to my father. That the story we always believed might not be the whole truth." Charlotte's brow furrowed. "Do you believe him?" "I do not know what to believe," Serafina admitted. "For 10 years I have carried this anger, certain of where to place the blame. And now this man, of all people, tells me the picture is incomplete, and I find myself wondering if he might be right." "Perhaps it is worth learning the truth, whatever it may be," Charlotte offered gently. "Perhaps," Serafina murmured, though her eyes had drifted to the window, staring out at the overgrown gardens that once, long ago, had been the pride of her family's estate, before everything fell apart. Later that morning, Serafina's brother, Nathaniel Voss, found her in the small library that remained one of the few untouched rooms in the house, most of its shelves still holding books their father had collected before his ruin forced the sale of nearly everything else of value. "I heard about the ball," Nathaniel said, settling into the chair across from her. 2 years younger than his sister, Nathaniel had always carried their father's downfall with quieter bitterness, less inclined toward public confrontation, but no less affected by it. "Then you have heard the same story everyone else has," Serafina said. "I heard you demanded he bow, and he danced with you instead. I also heard the two of you spoke privately on the terrace for quite some time." "We discussed old business," Serafina said carefully. Nathaniel's eyes sharpened. "What kind of old business?" Serafina hesitated before answering. "He claims there may be more to what happened to father than we have always believed. He says he intends to search through his family's old records to find out." Nathaniel's expression darkened. "And you believed him?" "I did not say that. But you are considering it," Nathaniel pressed. "Serafina, the Colbrooks ruined this family. Whatever charming words this new duke offers you, do not forget that." "I have not forgotten anything," Serafina said sharply. "Least of all the years we spent watching father fade into himself, ashamed of what he lost. But if there is truth, we do not yet know. Nathaniel, would you rather remain ignorant, simply because uncovering it is uncomfortable?" Nathaniel fell silent for a moment, clearly torn between old resentment and the small, unwelcome curiosity his sister's words had stirred in him. "Be careful," he said finally. "Whatever this duke tells you, remember that his family has every reason to rewrite the story in their favor." "I intend to be careful," Serafina said. "For both our sakes." That afternoon, in the private study of his townhouse, several miles from Ashcombe Manor, Lord Callum Reyes read a hastily written message from one of his informants among the manor staff, describing the Duke's early morning conversation with his steward, and the mention of old family records being searched. Reyes set the letter down and stared out his window for a long moment, his fingers drumming slowly against the polished wood of his desk. 10 years he had spent building his current position, carefully distancing himself from the events that had destroyed the Voss family's standing, while quietly benefiting from the chaos that followed. If Adrian Colebrook truly intended to search through old correspondence in pursuit of missing pieces, there was a real danger he might eventually stumble upon evidence Reyes had spent a decade ensuring stayed buried. He rang a small bell on his desk, and moments later, a quiet, sharp-eyed man named Victor Ames entered the room, one of the few people Reyes trusted with matters requiring discretion. "I need information," Reyes said without preamble. "The new Duke of Ashcombe is searching through old family records, specifically correspondence, involving the Voss family's business dealings from a decade ago. I need to know exactly what he has found, and I need to know before he finds anything that could cause complications." "Complications for whom, my lord?" Victor asked carefully. Reyes's eyes narrowed slightly. "For everyone whose reputation depends on the story remaining exactly as it has always been told." Victor nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "I will see what can be arranged." Quietly, Reyes emphasized. The Duke must not suspect anyone is watching his progress. And Victor, if the Duchess Voss becomes involved in his search, I want to know immediately. Their sudden closeness at last night's ball concerns me more than I would like to admit. Victor bowed slightly and left the room, and Reyes returned to staring out the window, his mind already working through the various ways he might slow down, redirect, or if necessary, permanently end the young Duke's search for the truth. Back at Ashcombe Manor, Edmund returned to the study late in the afternoon, carrying a small bundle of aged letters tied together with faded string. Adrian looked up eagerly as his aide set the bundle carefully on the desk. I found these tucked behind a false panel in the archive room, Edmund said. Your father must have hidden them deliberately. They are correspondence between him and Lord Reyes, dated during the exact period when the Voss family's fortunes collapsed. Adrian's pulse quickened as he carefully untied the string and began reading through the letters, his eyes scanning quickly at first, then slowing as the content became clearer. His father's handwriting, careful and precise, described growing concerns about certain financial arrangements Reyes had proposed, involving joint investments with the Voss family's estate. Later letters grew increasingly troubled, mentioning discrepancies in shipping records and questions about funds that seemed to disappear without proper explanation. This is not what I expected, Adrian murmured, reading further. My father suspected something was wrong, long before the collapse happened. He tried to warn someone, though it is not clear who. Keep reading, Edmund urged quietly. Adrian turned to the final letter in the bundle, dated only weeks before the Voss family's ruin became public knowledge. His father's handwriting had grown noticeably more urgent, describing a confrontation with Reyes over missing funds and threats made in response to questions being asked too loudly. The letter ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as though something had interrupted its writing entirely. Adrian set the letter down slowly, his hands trembling slightly with the weight of what he had just read. My father knew, he said quietly. He knew something was wrong, and either he was silenced somehow, or he grew too afraid to continue pursuing it. What will you do? Edmund asked. I will finish what he started, Adrian said, his voice hardening with quiet resolve. But carefully, Edmund. If Reyes was capable of frightening my father into silence a decade ago, I have no doubt he remains dangerous now. We proceed quietly, and we gather everything we can before anyone realizes exactly what we are looking for. Edmund nodded, though concern remained visible in his expression. And the Duchess Voss? Will you tell her what you have found? Adrian considered the question carefully, thinking of Serafina's face on the terrace, the flicker of vulnerability behind her anger, the 10 years of blame she had carried against his family, for a crime that increasingly appeared to belong to someone else entirely. Not yet, he said finally. Not until I have enough evidence to give her something more solid than suspicion. She deserves the truth, Edmund, not half-formed theories that might collapse under questioning. But when the time comes, she will be the first to know. Outside, the gray morning mist had finally burned away, leaving a clear, pale sky stretching over the manor grounds. Though neither Adrian nor Edmund noticed the change in weather, both far too consumed by the growing certainty that the true story behind the Voss family's ruin was far more dangerous than either of them had first imagined. 10 years earlier, the Voss estate had stood among the finest properties in the county, its gardens envied by every neighboring family, its halls filled with laughter during summer gatherings that lasted long into the night. Serafina remembered those years, only in fragments now. Brief flashes of golden afternoons, and her father's booming laugh echoing through rooms that had since fallen quiet and half-empty. She sat alone in her father's old study that evening, a room she rarely entered anymore, its shelves still lined with books he had loved, its desk still holding a few scattered papers no one had bothered to clear away after his passing 3 years earlier. She ran her fingers along the edge of the desk, remembering how he used to sit here for hours, poring over ledgers and correspondence, always cheerful despite the long hours of work. Then came the year everything changed. She had been only 16, too young to understand the full scope of what was happening, only aware that her father's cheerful demeanor had slowly given way to something quieter, more troubled. Meetings grew tense. Letters arrived that made him pace the halls late into the night. And then, within months, everything collapsed. Investments failed, debts called in without warning, properties sold at devastating losses. By the time the dust settled, the Voss family retained only this house and a fraction of the wealth they had once commanded. Her father had blamed Adrian's family from the very beginning, specifically the elder Duke Colebrook, whose business dealings had been intertwined with theirs during those final troubled months. He never fully explained the details to his children, only that trust had been broken, promises unfulfilled, and their family's fortune sacrificed to protect someone else's interests. Serafina had accepted this story without question for a decade, allowing it to shape not just her understanding of the past, but her entire approach toward the new Duke of Ashcombe from the moment she learned of his inheritance. But now, sitting in this quiet, dusty study, she found herself questioning things she had never questioned before. Why had her father never named exactly what happened, beyond vague blame directed at the Colebrook family? Why had he grown so withdrawn in his final years, refusing to speak of the collapse even when directly asked? And why, if the blame truly belonged entirely to Adrian's father, had young Adrian himself seemed so genuinely troubled last night, so determined to find missing pieces rather than defend his family's reputation outright? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Charlotte entered, carrying a small lantern to combat the growing darkness outside. "My lady, you have been sitting here for quite some time. Shall I bring tea?" "Please," Serafina said, though her mind remained elsewhere. "Charlotte, do you remember much from the years before Father's ruin? You were with our family even then, were you not?" Charlotte considered the question carefully before answering. "I remember your father growing increasingly withdrawn during those final months. He met often with a gentleman I did not know well, though I recall the name mentioned in passing more than once. Lord Reyes, I believe." Serafina's breath caught slightly. "Reyes? Are you certain?" "Fairly certain, my lady. He visited the estate several times during that period, always for private meetings with your father. After the collapse, I never saw him again, though I assumed simply that your father's circle of associates changed along with everything else." Serafina sat back slowly, her mind racing. She had heard the name Reyes mentioned occasionally in society circles over the years, always in connection with successful business ventures and growing influence, but she had never once connected him to her father's ruin. The story she had always believed centered entirely on the Colebrook family, with no mention of anyone else involved. "Thank you, Charlotte," she said quietly. "That will be all for now." Charlotte left the room, and Serafina remained seated at her father's old desk, staring at the scattered papers before her with new eyes. She began sorting through them carefully, searching for anything that might mention Reyes directly, though most of what remained consisted of old household accounts and personal correspondence, unrelated to the business dealings that had destroyed their fortune. Near the bottom of one drawer, tucked beneath a stack of unremarkable letters, she found a small, worn journal she did not recognize. Opening it carefully, she realized it belonged to her father, filled with private notes and observations he had never shared with the family. The final entries, dated during the months leading up to the collapse, grew increasingly troubled in tone, mentioning suspicions about missing funds and a business partner whose promises had proven hollow. One entry, dated only weeks before everything fell apart, stopped her breath entirely. Her father had written about a confrontation with someone he trusted, someone who had convinced him to invest heavily in a venture that ultimately proved fraudulent. He named no one directly in this entry, clearly cautious even in his private writing, but he mentioned meeting with Duke Colebrook shortly afterward, seeking advice on how to recover from what he now suspected was deliberate deception rather than simple bad fortune. Serafina read the passage 3 times, her hands trembling slightly. If her father had suspected deliberate deception from someone other than the Colebrook family, and had sought Duke Colebrook's advice specifically, then the entire foundation of blame she had carried for a decade might be built on a story far more complicated than she had ever understood. She closed the journal carefully and held it against her chest, staring out the darkened window at the overgrown gardens beyond. Whatever truth remained buried in these old papers, she now understood she could not uncover it alone. And there was only one person currently searching for the same missing pieces she had just begun to glimpse. The following morning, Serafina arrived unannounced at Ashcombe Manor, her carriage rattling up the long drive as pale sunlight filtered through scattered clouds overhead. Edmund met her at the entrance, visibly surprised by her sudden appearance. "Duchess Voss," he said carefully, "I was not informed of your visit." "Because I did not inform anyone," Serafina said. "I need to speak with the Duke immediately. It concerns a matter of some urgency." Edmund hesitated only briefly before leading her toward the study, where Adrian looked up from his desk, equally surprised to see her standing in his doorway, a small worn journal clutched tightly in her hands. "Duchess Voss," he said, rising from his chair. "This is unexpected." "I found something," she said, without preamble, stepping into the room and setting the journal down on his desk. "My father's private journal, hidden away for years. He suspected deliberate deception during the months before our ruin, deception from someone other than your family. He sought your father's advice specifically, which makes no sense if your family was truly responsible for what happened." Adrian's expression sharpened with cautious interest as he carefully opened the journal, scanning the entries she indicated. "This confirms what I found in my own father's correspondence," he said slowly. "He suspected something was wrong, long before your family's collapse became public. He tried to warn someone, though the letters I found do not make clear exactly who." Serafina's eyes widened slightly. "You found correspondence as well?" "Letters between my father and a man named Lord Reyes," Adrian said carefully, watching her reaction closely. "Discussing joint investments involving your family's estate, and later, growing suspicions about missing funds." Serafina's face paled visibly. "My maid mentioned that name yesterday. She remembered him visiting my father privately during those final months, though I never once connected him to what happened." "Because the story we were both told never mentioned him at all," Adrian said quietly. "Someone ensured his name disappeared from the narrative entirely, while my family absorbed all the blame instead." They stared at each other for a long moment, the weight of this shared discovery settling heavily between them. Whatever animosity had defined their previous encounters now felt increasingly irrelevant compared to the growing certainty that a far more dangerous truth remained hidden beneath the surface of what they had both believed for a decade. "We need to find more," Serafina said finally. "Whatever happened, Reyes is clearly connected, and if he orchestrated this deception a decade ago, he has spent years ensuring the truth remained buried. He will not welcome our questions." "No," Adrian agreed grimly. "He will not, which means we must proceed carefully, and quietly, until we have gathered enough evidence to make our case undeniable." Serafina studied him for a moment, something shifting in her expression, the last remnants of her earlier hostility, giving way to cautious, reluctant partnership. "Then we search together," she said. "For both our families' sakes." Adrian extended his hand, and this time, she took it without hesitation, sealing an alliance neither of them had expected only 2 days earlier, born not from affection, but from the shared pursuit of a truth that threatened to unravel everything they had once believed. News of Serafina's visit to Ashcombe Manor spread through the county faster than either of them anticipated. By that evening, whispers had already reached several drawing rooms, twisted and reshaped with each retelling, until the simple fact of her carriage arriving at the manor became a scandal of its own, entirely separate from the ball 3 nights earlier. Lord Callum Reyes received word of the visit through Victor Ames within hours, delivered in a hushed private meeting at his townhouse. Reyes listened carefully, his expression giving away nothing, though his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against the arm of his chair. "She visited him directly," Reyes repeated slowly. "Not through formal correspondence, not through an intermediary, but in person, unannounced." "According to the staff, yes, my lord," Victor confirmed. "She remained in his study for nearly an hour before departing." No one overheard the conversation, though one of the kitchen maids mentioned seeing the Duchess carrying a small book of some kind when she arrived. Reyes rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the window, staring out at the darkening street below. A decade of careful work, of quiet influence, and calculated reputation building, all of it depended on the story remaining exactly as it had always been told. If Adrian and Serafina had begun comparing notes, sharing documents, connecting fragments neither of them had previously understood, the danger to his position grew significantly more urgent than he had first assessed. "I want their movements watched closely from this point forward," Reyes said finally. "Every visit, every letter, every meeting between them, or with anyone who might assist their search. And Victor, I want to know exactly what documents exist that could cause difficulty, wherever they might be hidden." "That could prove difficult, my lord," Victor said carefully. "The Duke's family archive is extensive, and the Voss family retains considerably more old correspondence than most assume, given how little else survived their collapse." "Then we will need to be thorough," Reyes said, his voice hardening with quiet determination. Whatever it takes, Victor. I intend to ensure this matter remains buried exactly where it has rested for the past 10 years. Meanwhile, at Ashcombe Manor, Adrian and Serafina had spent the following days meeting regularly, though always with careful discretion, aware that their sudden alliance would only fuel further gossip if discovered too openly. They met in the Manor's library, surrounded by stacks of old correspondence, ledgers, and documents pulled from both family archives, piecing together a picture that grew more troubling with each new discovery. "Look at this," Serafina said one afternoon, sliding a faded ledger page across the table toward Adrian. "This is from my father's private accounts, dated the same month as one of your father's letters. The amounts match almost exactly, though listed under different descriptions in each ledger." Adrian studied the numbers carefully, comparing them against the letter beside it. "This looks like funds moved between accounts under false pretenses," he said slowly. "Your father believed he was investing in a legitimate venture. My father's letter mentions the same amount, described as compensation for a separate arrangement entirely." "Meaning someone structured the transaction specifically to hide its true purpose," Serafina said, her voice tight with growing anger, though this anger no longer aimed itself at Adrian. "Reyes convinced my father to invest in something that never truly existed, then used the resulting funds elsewhere, all while ensuring the paper trail looked legitimate enough to survive scrutiny. And when your father grew suspicious," Adrian added, "he confronted Reyes directly, which likely triggered whatever final action caused the complete collapse of your family's fortune." Serafina sat back slowly, processing the full weight of what they had uncovered. 10 years, she said quietly. 10 years I blamed your family, hated your family, built my entire understanding of the world around this injustice, and it was never even the truth. You could not have known, Adrian said gently. Reyes ensured that no one could know, not without exactly this kind of careful searching. That does not make the years of misplaced anger any easier to accept, Serafina said, though some of the sharpness had left her voice, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. Adrian reached across the table, though he stopped short of touching her hand, uncertain whether such familiarity would be welcome, given how recently their relationship had shifted from open hostility to cautious partnership. "We have enough now to understand what happened," he said instead, "but not yet enough to prove it beyond doubt, especially against a man as influential as Reyes has become. We need something undeniable, something that connects him directly, rather than through circumstantial documents alone." "What do you suggest?" Serafina asked. "My father's final letter mentioned a confrontation," Adrian said. "One that seems to have ended abruptly, possibly interrupted. If Reyes threatened him directly, there may be a witness, someone who observed that confrontation, or who Reyes trusted enough to involve in covering its aftermath. Someone still alive after 10 years, willing to speak against a man as powerful as Reyes has become," Serafina said skeptically. "That seems unlikely." "Perhaps," Adrian admitted, "but my father kept careful records of his household staff during those years. If any of them remain in the area, they may remember something useful, even if they never understood its full significance at the time." Serafina considered this for a moment before nodding slowly. "I have an idea as well. My father's old business partner, a man named Gerald Finch, handled much of the family's legal affairs during those years, before retiring shortly after our collapse. He may remember details my father never shared with the family directly." "Then we have two paths to pursue," Adrian said. "Carefully, and separately at first, to avoid drawing unnecessary attention while we gather what we need." They spent the remainder of the afternoon dividing their research, Adrian agreeing to track down any surviving household staff from his father's era, while Serafina planned to visit Gerald Finch under the guise of a routine social call, careful not to reveal the true purpose of her visit until she understood how much he might be willing to share. As evening approached and Serafina prepared to depart, she paused at the study door, glancing back at Adrian, who remained seated among the scattered papers, his expression thoughtful and slightly weary from the day's careful work. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not simply defending your family's innocence and leaving me to sort through the rest alone. Most men in your position would have done exactly that, satisfied simply to clear their own name." "Your family deserves the truth as much as mine does," Adrian said. "Perhaps more, given how much more your family lost." Serafina held his gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, before she finally nodded and departed, her carriage rattling down the long drive as dusk settled over the manor grounds. Unknown to either of them, Victor Ames had positioned himself among the trees lining the drive earlier that afternoon, watching the comings and goings at Ashcombe Manor with careful, patient attention. He noted the duration of Serafina's visit, the late hour of her departure, and the visible exhaustion on both their faces as they parted at the study door, details he would report to Lord Reyes before the night ended. Reyes received this report with growing unease. Whatever Adrian and Serafina had discovered together clearly troubled them both deeply, and their continued collaboration suggested they had moved well beyond simple curiosity into genuine, dangerous investigation. He would need to act soon, before their careful searching uncovered something that could not be explained away or buried once again beneath a decade of carefully maintained silence. He summoned Victor once more that same night, his instructions this time carrying an edge of urgency that had not existed in their previous conversations. "Find out exactly who they intend to speak with next," he said, "and ensure those conversations never take place, or if they must take place, ensure nothing useful comes from them." Victor bowed and departed, and Reyes remained alone in his study long into the night, staring at the fire crackling in his hearth, calculating exactly how far he was willing to go to protect the careful construction of lies that had sustained his position and influence for the past decade. Gerald Finch had lived a quiet, unremarkable life since retiring from legal practice nearly 8 years earlier. His small cottage tucked at the edge of a village several miles from the Voss estate, surrounded by a modest garden he tended with obsessive care. Serafina arrived unannounced late one morning, her carriage drawing curious glances from villagers who recognized the Voss family crest, even after all these years of diminished standing. Finch answered his own door, his hair entirely gray now, his eyes still sharp despite his advancing age. Surprise flickered across his face when he recognized his visitor. "Duchess Voss," he said, straightening slightly. "This is quite unexpected." "Mr. Finch," Serafina said, offering a polite smile. "I hope I am not intruding. I found myself passing through the village and thought I might pay a visit, given how long it has been since we last spoke." Finch studied her for a moment, clearly aware that a duchess did not simply happen to pass through a modest village without deliberate purpose, but he stepped aside regardless, gesturing for her to enter. "Please, come in. I confess I have often wondered how your family has fared since those difficult years." His cottage was small, but comfortable, filled with books and legal texts that lined every available shelf, remnants of a career he clearly still held dear despite his retirement. He offered her tea, which she accepted, allowing several minutes of polite conversation about the weather and village life, before finally steering the discussion toward her true purpose. "Mr. Finch," she said carefully, "I have recently begun looking into the circumstances surrounding my father's financial collapse. I understand you handled much of his legal affairs during those years." Finch's expression grew visibly guarded. "That was a difficult period, Duchess. I am not certain revisiting it serves any useful purpose now." "I believe it might," Serafina pressed gently. "I have recently learned that the story I always believed, that my father's ruin resulted entirely from dealings with the Colebrook family, may not be the complete truth. I have reason to believe another party was involved, someone whose name has since disappeared from the narrative entirely." Finch set down his teacup slowly, his hands showing a slight tremor that Serafina suspected had little to do with age. "Duchess, some matters are best left undisturbed." "With respect, Mr. Finch, this matter has never truly been left undisturbed. It has simply been buried, and its consequences have shaped my family's fortune and reputation for a decade. If there is truth you know that could correct this injustice, I ask you to share it, whatever discomfort it may cause." Finch remained silent for a long moment, staring into the fire crackling in his modest hearth, clearly wrestling with some internal conflict Serafina could not fully understand. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Your father came to me shortly before everything collapsed, seeking legal advice regarding a business partner he had grown to distrust. He believed funds were being misused, diverted toward purposes entirely different from what he had been promised." "Lord Reyes," Serafina said quietly. Finch's eyes widened slightly at the name, though he did not deny it. "I advised your father to proceed cautiously, to gather documentation before making any accusations. He agreed, though I fear he grew impatient, or perhaps simply desperate, and confronted the matter more directly than I had recommended." "What happened?" Serafina asked, leaning forward slightly. I do not know entirely, Finch admitted. Your father stopped consulting me shortly afterward, and within weeks, his fortune had collapsed entirely. I always suspected something more had occurred, some confrontation, or threat, that silenced him, before he could pursue the matter properly. But I had no proof, and by then, the damage was already done. Pursuing the matter further seemed pointless, particularly given the influence Lord Reyes had already begun accumulating. You were afraid, Serafina said softly, not unkindly. Finch met her eyes, something like shame flickering across his weathered features. I was a young lawyer with a growing practice, and a family to support, Duchess. Lord Reyes made it clear, through indirect channels, that pursuing questions about your father's collapse would prove professionally costly. I chose silence over risk, and I have lived with that choice ever since. Serafina absorbed this information carefully, understanding now the full scope of what Reyes had constructed over the past decade. Not simply a single act of deception, but a carefully maintained web of silence extending across everyone who might have exposed the truth. Do you still have any documentation from that period? She asked. Anything at all that might have survived? Finch hesitated, before rising slowly and moving toward a locked cabinet in the corner of his small study. He retrieved a key from his desk drawer and opened it carefully, revealing a small collection of aged files he had apparently kept hidden for years. I preserved certain documents, he admitted. Copies of correspondence, notes from my meetings with your father, details I never shared with anyone, uncertain whether they would ever prove useful or simply dangerous to possess. He handed the files to Serafina, who accepted them with careful, reverent hands, understanding the weight of what she now held. Thank you, Mr. Finch. This could change everything. Be careful, Duchess, Finch warned, his voice edged with genuine concern. Lord Reyes did not become as powerful as he is today through kindness alone. If you pursue this matter openly, you will make a dangerous adversary. I am aware of the risk, Serafina said, rising to leave. But my family has already lost everything once because of silence and fear. I will not allow that same silence to continue, simply because the truth proves inconvenient for someone else's reputation. As she departed the cottage, her carriage rattling back toward Voss House with the precious files secured carefully beside her, she did not notice the figure watching from a distance near the edge of the village. A man Reyes had positioned there specifically to monitor exactly this kind of visit. Victor Ames watched the Duchess's carriage disappear down the road before approaching Finch's cottage himself, knocking politely at the door the old lawyer had barely closed moments earlier. Finch opened the door, his expression shifting immediately from cautious relief to visible alarm upon recognizing his new visitor. Mr. Ames, he said carefully, I was not expecting further guests today. I imagine not, Victor said, stepping uninvited into the small cottage, his eyes scanning the room quickly, noting the empty space in the locked cabinet, where files had clearly been removed only moments earlier. The Duchess Voss paid you quite a visit, I understand. Finch's face paled visibly. I do not know what you mean. Please, Mr. Finch, let us not waste each other's time, Victor said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge of threat beneath its politeness. Lord Reyes values your continued discretion greatly, as he has for the past decade. I would hate for circumstances to change that arrangement unfavorably. Finch swallowed hard, understanding the implicit warning entirely. I told her nothing of substance, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Victor studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. See that it remains that way, Mr. Finch, for your own sake and for the sake of the quiet life you have built here. He departed without further explanation, leaving Finch standing alone in his small cottage, trembling slightly as he realized the full danger he had just invited into his carefully preserved retirement by finally choosing honesty over silence after 10 long years. Meanwhile, back at Ashcombe Manor, Adrian had spent the same day locating and speaking with several former household staff members who had served during his father's era, though most offered little beyond vague recollections of tension and hushed conversations they had never fully understood at the time. One elderly former groundskeeper, however, mentioned something that caught Adrian's immediate attention. There was a night, the old man recalled slowly, sitting in the modest cottage where he now lived in quiet retirement, when your father received a late visitor, quite agitated, quite angry. I remember hearing raised voices from the study, though I could not make out the words clearly. The visitor departed abruptly, and your father seemed deeply shaken afterward. This was shortly before the Voss family's troubles became public knowledge, if memory serves. Do you remember who the visitor was? Adrian asked eagerly. The old man considered the question carefully, before shaking his head slowly. I could not say for certain, Your Grace. It was dark, and I did not see his face clearly. But I do recall the carriage that brought him, a distinctive black carriage with unusual silver trim along its wheels. I had never seen it before, and I never saw it again afterward. Adrian's mind raced, connecting this detail to fragments he had already gathered from his father's letters. Thank you, he said, rising quickly. This may prove more useful than you realize. He returned to Ashcombe Manor that evening, with renewed determination, eager to compare this new detail against everything Serafina might have uncovered during her own visit to Gerald Finch, unaware that both of their careful investigations had already drawn the dangerous attention of a man determined to protect his secrets at any cost. Adrian and Serafina met again the following morning at Ashcombe Manor, both carrying the weight of what they had separately discovered the previous day. Serafina laid out the files retrieved from Gerald Finch across the library table, while Adrian described the groundskeeper's account of a distinctive black carriage with silver trim visiting his father late one evening, shortly before the collapse became public. A carriage like that would belong to someone of considerable wealth, Serafina said, studying the description carefully. Reyes certainly fits that description, though we still lack anything connecting him directly to that specific visit. Finch's files may help with that, Adrian said, carefully reading through the documents she had brought. His eyes stopped on one particular page, a handwritten note detailing a meeting between her father and Finch, describing specific suspicions about fraudulent investment schemes, and naming Reyes directly as the business partner involved. This is more direct than anything we have found so far, Adrian said. Finch clearly knew exactly who was responsible, even if he never pursued the matter further out of fear. He admitted as much to me, Serafina said quietly. Reyes threatened his career if he ever spoke of it. That threat clearly worked for the past decade. Until now, Adrian said. We need to convince him to testify formally, to put his knowledge on record where it cannot simply be dismissed as rumor or speculation. That will not be easy, Serafina warned. He was frightened enough simply speaking to me privately. Formal testimony against a man as powerful as Reyes would put him at considerably greater risk. Before Adrian could respond, Edmund entered the library, his expression tense with urgent news. Your Grace, I have just received word from the village near Mr. Finch's cottage. There has been an incident. Both Adrian and Serafina rose immediately, alarm evident on their faces. What kind of incident? Adrian demanded. Mr. Finch's cottage caught fire late last night, Edmund said grimly. The villagers managed to extinguish it before serious damage occurred, but his study, including whatever documents remained inside, was completely destroyed. Fortunately, Mr. Finch himself was unharmed, having been visiting a neighbor at the time. Serafina's face went pale. This cannot be coincidence. No, Adrian agreed, his jaw tightening with barely controlled anger. Reyes must have learned of your visit and moved quickly to destroy whatever remained before we could use it further. Then it is fortunate I already retrieved these files before the fire occurred, Serafina said, gesturing toward the documents spread across the table. Otherwise, we would have lost everything Finch preserved. We need to ensure his safety, Adrian said. If Reyes is willing to destroy evidence this directly, he may be willing to take further action against Finch himself, particularly if he suspects the old lawyer spoke to you about what he knew. I will send word immediately, urging him to leave the village until this matter is resolved, Serafina said, already moving toward the writing desk in the corner of the library. As she composed her urgent letter, Adrian paced slowly near the window, his mind working through the implications of Reyes's swift, decisive action. This confirms everything we suspected, he said. Reyes is not simply protecting an old reputation. He is actively working to prevent this truth from surfacing, which suggests the consequences of exposure would prove far more damaging than mere embarrassment. What do you mean? Serafina asked, looking up from her letter. I mean that a man secure in his position does not burn down an old lawyer's cottage over decade-old rumors, Adrian said. He does so because he fears something specific, something concrete enough to threaten his current standing entirely, not merely his reputation from the past. Serafina considered this carefully. Do you think there is more to uncover, something beyond the initial fraud itself? I believe so, Adrian said, and I believe we need to find it quickly, before he takes more drastic action to protect himself. Later that same day, word arrived that Gerald Finch had accepted Serafina's urgent advice and departed the village entirely, seeking temporary refuge with a distant relative in a neighboring county, carrying with him nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever small savings he had managed to gather quickly before leaving. The abrupt departure only confirmed how seriously he understood the danger Reyes now posed to his safety. Lord Reyes, meanwhile, received confirmation of the fire's success from Victor Ames that same evening, though the accompanying news troubled him considerably more than he let show. Finch has fled the village, Victor reported. According to local gossip, he departed suddenly, without explanation, shortly after the fire occurred. And the files? Reyes asked sharply. Were they destroyed as intended? Victor hesitated slightly before answering. The cabinet where he kept them was found empty, my lord. It appears he may have already given the documents away before the fire took place, likely to the Duchess Voss during her earlier visit. Reyes's expression darkened considerably. Then our efforts accomplished nothing beyond confirming their suspicions and alerting them further to how seriously we regard this matter. What would you have me do now, my lord? Victor asked carefully. Reyes remained silent for a long moment, calculating his options with the same careful precision that had sustained his position for the past decade. We need to shift our approach, he said finally. If destroying evidence only strengthens their resolve, we must instead discredit whatever they eventually present, ensuring that even if they gather sufficient proof, no one of influence will believe it credible. How do you propose we accomplish that? Victor asked. By ensuring the story surrounding their investigation becomes one of personal vendetta rather than genuine pursuit of truth, Reyes said, a cold, calculating smile beginning to form. The Duchess Voss already has a public reputation for harboring resentment against the Colebrook family. If we can suggest that her sudden alliance with the young Duke stems from manipulation, or worse, from some scheme to restore her family's fortune through his title, rather than genuine pursuit of justice, we may successfully undermine whatever evidence they eventually present. Victor nodded slowly, understanding the strategy taking shape. And the Duke himself? His humble origins already make him vulnerable to certain kinds of suspicion, Reyes said. If we suggest he pursues this investigation, not from genuine concern for justice, but from a desire to secure favor with a duchess whose family once held considerably higher standing than his own, we create doubt about his motives as well. A campaign of rumor and suspicion, Victor said, rather than direct confrontation. Exactly, Reyes confirmed. Subtle, deniable, and considerably more difficult to counter than any accusation we might make directly. Begin spreading these suggestions carefully among the appropriate social circles. By the time they present whatever evidence they eventually gather, I intend for no one of consequence to believe a word of it. Victor departed to begin implementing this new strategy, while Reyes remained alone in his study, staring at the fire with grim determination. Whatever truth Adrian and Serafina continued to uncover, he intended to ensure it arrived too late, or too discredited, to threaten the careful empire he had built upon a decade of buried lies. Back at Ashcombe Manor, unaware of the new danger taking shape against them, Adrian and Serafina continued sorting through the documents Finch had provided, searching for any additional clue that might explain why Reyes had reacted with such immediate, drastic urgency to their investigation. There is something here, Serafina said suddenly, holding up a page she had previously overlooked. A reference to a second investment scheme, separate from the one involving my father, dated several years after our family's collapse. Adrian leaned closer, studying the page carefully. This suggests Reyes did not stop after ruining your family. He continued the same scheme with other victims, using the wealth gained from your father's ruin to fund further deception. If that is true, Serafina said slowly, then we are not simply seeking justice for my family alone. We may be uncovering a pattern that has harmed considerably more people than either of us realized, which explains his desperation to keep this buried, Adrian said grimly. If this pattern becomes public, the consequences will extend far beyond his relationship with either of our families. His entire fortune and reputation would collapse entirely. Serafina met his eyes, determination hardening her expression. Then we must find the others he has harmed. If we can gather multiple witnesses, multiple victims willing to speak against him together, his influence alone will not be enough to silence us all. Agreed, Adrian said. But we must move carefully, and quickly, before he anticipates our next steps, and moves to counter them as decisively as he moved against Finch. Neither of them yet understood the quieter, more insidious campaign Reyes had already set into motion, one that would not target their evidence directly, but rather their reputations, their credibility, and the trust of everyone whose support they would eventually need to expose the truth entirely. Within a week, whispers began circulating through the county's social circles, carried carefully from one drawing room to another, each retelling adding new details that painted Adrian and Serafina's alliance in an increasingly unflattering light. Lady Margaret Ashford, still one of Adrian's few genuine allies among the local nobility, arrived at Ashcombe Manor one afternoon, with visible concern etched across her features. "You must be aware of what people are saying," she said, settling into the chair Edmund offered her in the drawing room. "The story making its rounds suggests the Duchess Voss has manipulated you into this investigation, using old grievances to secure a claim on your title and fortune, given how considerably her family's standing has diminished over the years." Adrian's expression tightened with frustration. "That is absurd. Anyone who witnessed our initial encounter at the ball would know this alliance began from confrontation, not manipulation. People remember what they wish to remember, Your Grace, particularly when a more scandalous version of events proves considerably more entertaining," Margaret said gently. "There are also suggestions circulating about your own motives, that you pursue this investigation not from genuine concern for justice, but from a desire to secure favor with a woman whose family once held far higher standing than your own, before your unexpected inheritance." "Where are these rumors originating?" Adrian asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I cannot say for certain," Margaret admitted, "but the timing seems suspicious, given how recently your investigation began attracting attention. Someone with considerable influence appears determined to undermine your credibility before you can present whatever evidence you continue to gather." Adrian's jaw tightened further. "Reyes, I make no accusations myself," Margaret said carefully, "but you would do well to consider who benefits most from your efforts, appearing discredited, before they can gain any serious traction among people of influence." After Margaret departed, Adrian sat alone in his study for a long while, the weight of this new development settling heavily upon him. He had anticipated resistance from Reyes, perhaps even further attempts to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses, but this quieter campaign of reputation damage proved considerably more difficult to counter directly, lacking any clear target he could confront or expose. Serafina arrived later that same day, having heard similar rumors circulating within her own social circles, her expression carrying the same frustrated determination Adrian felt himself. "They are calling me a fortune seeker," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk, "suggesting I orchestrated this entire alliance to secure your title for my family's benefit, rather than genuine pursuit of the truth. I have heard similar suggestions about myself," Adrian said grimly, "that I pursue this matter to win your favor, rather than justice for either family." "This is Reyes's doing," Serafina said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "He cannot destroy our evidence directly, without confirming our suspicions further. So instead, he seeks to ensure that even if we present it, no one will believe us credible enough to matter." "A clever strategy," Adrian admitted. "Considerably harder to counter than direct confrontation." "Then we must counter it regardless," Serafina said firmly. "We cannot allow rumor and suspicion to undermine years of careful evidence gathering. We need something undeniable, something that speaks for itself regardless of whatever personal motives people wish to assign us." "The other victims," Adrian said slowly, recalling the second investment scheme mentioned in Finch's documents. "If we can find them, gather their testimony alongside our own evidence, the pattern itself becomes undeniable, regardless of any suspicion cast upon our personal motives." "How do we identify them?" Serafina asked. Finch's documents mentioned the scheme, but provided no specific names. Adrian considered this carefully before an idea began forming. "My father's business records may contain references to other investors from that period, people who might have unknowingly participated in similar schemes without recognizing the pattern until years later. If we cross-reference names appearing across both my father's records and whatever documentation exists from Reyes's more recent business dealings, we may identify a pattern of victims connected across multiple years. That would require access to considerably more documentation than we currently possess, Serafina said. Reyes's more recent business dealings would not be readily available to either of us. Perhaps not directly, Adrian agreed. But my father maintained connections within certain business circles that I have not yet fully explored. There may be others willing to share what they know, particularly if we can demonstrate genuine evidence rather than simply rumor and suspicion. Over the following days, Adrian began quietly reaching out to former business associates of his father, carefully framing his inquiries to avoid revealing the full scope of his investigation, while still gathering useful information about Reyes's various business ventures over the past decade. Slowly, a pattern began emerging. Several instances where promising investment opportunities had ultimately collapsed under circumstances remarkably similar to what had happened to the Voss family years earlier. One name in particular caught his attention repeatedly across several conversations, a merchant family named the Bellamys, whose considerable fortune had similarly collapsed nearly 5 years after the Voss family's ruin, under circumstances that had never been fully explained publicly. The Bellamy family, Adrian said, presenting this discovery to Serafina during their next meeting. Their collapse occurred 5 years after your family's, and several business associates I have spoken with mention Reyes's involvement in their affairs during that same period, though nothing was ever proven definitively at the time. Do you know where they currently reside? Serafina asked eagerly. According to my sources, they relocated to a smaller property near the coast after their collapse, considerably reduced in circumstances, but still residing in the county, Adrian said. I believe we should visit them directly, carefully, to determine whether they might be willing to share their experience alongside what we have already gathered. They departed the following morning, traveling together toward the coastal property where the Bellamy family now resided, their carriage winding through increasingly rural countryside as they moved further from the grander estates surrounding Ashcombe Manor and Voss House. The Bellamy residence, when they finally arrived, proved considerably more modest than either had expected. A simple farmhouse surrounded by working fields, rather than the elaborate gardens typical of noble estates. An older woman answered their knock, her expression guarded as she recognized the fine carriage and clothing marking her visitors as considerably above her current station. Mrs. Bellamy, Adrian said carefully. My name is Adrian Colebrook, Duke of Ashcombe. This is Duchess Serafina Voss. We wish to speak with you regarding your family's financial difficulties from several years ago, if you would be willing to share what you remember. The woman's expression shifted quickly from guarded curiosity to visible unease. That is a painful subject, Your Grace. I am not certain what purpose revisiting it now would serve. We believe your family's collapse may be connected to a pattern of deliberate fraud that has affected multiple families across the county, including my own, Serafina said gently. We are seeking to expose this pattern and hold the responsible party accountable, but we require testimony from those affected to make our case undeniable. Mrs. Bellamy studied them both for a long moment, before finally stepping aside, gesturing for them to enter. My husband passed away 2 years ago, still troubled by what happened to us. Perhaps it is time someone finally sought the truth he never lived to see uncovered. Inside the modest farmhouse, over tea served in simple but carefully maintained cups, Mrs. Bellamy shared her family's story, remarkably similar in its details to what Serafina had already learned about her own father's ruin. A promising business partnership, growing suspicions about misused funds, a confrontation that preceded sudden, devastating collapse. Do you remember the name of the business partner involved? Adrian asked carefully. Mrs. Bellamy's expression hardened slightly. Lord Callum Reyes. My husband trusted him completely, right up until the moment everything fell apart. He never fully understood how thoroughly he had been deceived, not until it was far too late to recover anything. Serafina and Adrian exchanged a meaningful glance, confirmation settling heavily between them. Mrs. Bellamy, Serafina said carefully, would you be willing to provide formal testimony regarding your family's experience, alongside evidence we have already gathered from other affected families? Mrs. Bellamy hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of speaking openly against a man who had already demonstrated considerable influence and reach. What assurance do I have that speaking out will not simply invite further ruin upon what little remains of my family's dignity? None beyond our shared determination to see justice finally served, Adrian said honestly. But I promise you this, we will not stop until this pattern is fully exposed, and every family affected receives the acknowledgement and justice they deserve. Mrs. Bellamy studied him for a long moment, before finally nodding slowly. My husband deserved better than the silence that surrounded his ruin until his death. If speaking now finally brings some measure of justice to his memory, I am willing to take that risk. As they departed the Bellamy farmhouse that evening, carrying with them a new, powerful piece of testimony to add to their growing case against Reyes, neither Adrian nor Serafina yet realized how quickly word of their visit would reach the very man they sought to expose, nor how dramatically he would escalate his efforts to silence them once he understood the full scope of what they had begun uncovering together. Victor Ames delivered news of the Bellamy visit to Lord Reyes within a day, his tone carrying a rare edge of genuine concern that had not colored his previous reports. "They have found the Bellamy family, my lord. Mrs. Bellamy has agreed to provide testimony regarding her husband's ruin, connecting it directly to your involvement." Reyes rose sharply from his chair, all pretense of calm composure, abandoning him for the first time since this entire matter had begun. "This has gone considerably further than I anticipated. If they are actively seeking out other victims, gathering testimony deliberately, this is no longer simple curiosity about old family history. This is a coordinated effort to destroy me entirely." "What would you have me do, my lord?" Victor asked carefully. Reyes paced the length of his study, his mind working rapidly through increasingly limited options. "The rumor campaign alone will not be sufficient if they gather multiple credible witnesses willing to testify together. We need something more decisive, something that ends this matter entirely, before they can present their case publicly." "You are suggesting more direct action," Victor said quietly, understanding the implication behind his employer's words. "I am suggesting we protect what I have spent a decade building, by whatever means prove necessary," Reyes said coldly. "Find out exactly when and where they intend to present this evidence. If there is a gathering, a formal hearing, any occasion where they plan to make their case publicly, I need to know precisely when and where it will occur." Victor nodded slowly, though his expression carried visible unease at the direction this conversation had taken. "And if I discover such information, my lord, what precisely do you intend to do with it?" Reyes turned to face him directly, his eyes cold and calculating. "Whatever proves necessary to ensure that gathering never takes place, or that if it does, the evidence they intend to present somehow fails to reach anyone capable of acting upon it." Victor departed to begin this new phase of investigation. Though his unease lingered long after he left Reyes's study, a growing awareness that his employer's desperation had begun pushing him toward increasingly dangerous territory that could implicate them both, far more seriously than the original fraud ever had. Meanwhile, at Ashcombe Manor, Adrian and Serafina had begun planning exactly the kind of formal presentation Reyes feared most, recognizing that scattered testimony and documentation, however compelling individually, would carry considerably more weight if presented together before an audience capable of demanding accountability. "The regional magistrate holds a formal hearing each month, open to any matter of significant public concern," Adrian explained, reviewing the county's legal customs with Edmund's assistance. "If we can secure a place on the docket for the upcoming session, we could present our full case, including Mrs. Bellamy's testimony, Finch's documentation, and everything else we have gathered, before an authority with genuine power to investigate further and hold Reyes accountable." "That would require considerable preparation," Serafina said, "and it would also alert Reyes precisely to when and where we intend to strike, giving him time to prepare countermeasures of his own." "Perhaps," Adrian acknowledged, "but operating in complete secrecy indefinitely serves us little purpose either. At some point, we must present this evidence publicly, and the formal hearing offers the most legitimate venue available to us." They spent the following days finalizing their preparations, organizing documentation carefully, confirming Mrs. Bellamy's willingness to testify in person, and quietly reaching out to Gerald Finch, still residing with his distant relative, to determine whether he too might be willing to provide formal testimony, despite the danger it would invite. Finch, initially hesitant given the destruction of his cottage and the clear threat Reyes had already demonstrated, eventually agreed after considerable persuasion from Serafina, moved by her insistence that continued silence had already cost too many families their fortunes and dignity. "If I do not speak now," Finch said during their final conversation before the hearing, "I fear I will carry this same regret to my grave, just as your father did before me. Better to face whatever danger comes from speaking the truth, than to live the remainder of my life burdened by continued silence." As the date of the formal hearing approached, tension grew steadily between all parties involved. Reyes, aware through Victor's careful surveillance that a hearing had indeed been scheduled, though uncertain of its exact purpose until closer to the date, began preparing his own countermeasures, reaching out to allies within the magistrate's circle who might be persuaded to dismiss whatever evidence Adrian and Serafina intended to present. 3 days before the scheduled hearing, Adrian received an unexpected visitor at Ashcombe Manor, a young man he did not immediately recognize, though something in his nervous demeanor suggested urgent, unwelcome news. "Your Grace," the young man said, bowing hastily, "my name is Oliver Bennet. I work within Lord Reyes's household as a clerk, managing certain correspondence and records. I have come because my conscience will no longer allow me to remain silent." Adrian studied him carefully, cautious given the obvious risk that this could be another attempt at manipulation orchestrated by Reyes himself. "What is it you wish to share, Mr. Bennet?" "I have overheard conversations between Lord Reyes and his associate, Mr. Ames, regarding your upcoming hearing," Oliver said, his voice trembling slightly with evident fear. "They intend to ensure it does not proceed as you hope. I do not know the exact details of their plan, only that Lord Reyes spoke of ensuring the evidence you intend to present somehow fails to reach the magistrate's attention, whatever that may mean." "Why come to me with this information?" Adrian asked carefully. "You risk considerable danger by revealing your employer's private conversations." Oliver hesitated before answering. "My own family suffered under circumstances I have come to recognize as remarkably similar to what happened to the Voss and Bellamy families, though on a smaller scale that never drew significant attention. I have watched Lord Reyes grow increasingly powerful over the years, always suspecting something was deeply wrong beneath his carefully constructed reputation, but never possessing the courage to speak until now, when I finally understood others were already pursuing the same truth I had long suspected." Adrian's expression softened slightly, with genuine sympathy. "Thank you for your courage, Mr. Bennet. This information may prove invaluable in ensuring our hearing proceeds safely." After Oliver departed, having provided as much detail as he could recall regarding Reyes's plans, Adrian immediately sent word to Serafina, arranging an urgent meeting to discuss this new, troubling development. "If Reyes intends to interfere directly with the hearing itself, we must take additional precautions," Serafina said, once she arrived at Ashcombe Manor and heard Adrian's account of Oliver's visit. "Perhaps we should request additional security for the proceeding, or ensure copies of our evidence exist in multiple locations, in case he attempts to destroy or intercept what we intend to present." "A wise precaution," Adrian agreed. "I will speak with Edmund about arranging additional protection, and we should also consider informing the magistrate directly of the potential interference, ensuring he remains alert to any suspicious activity surrounding the proceeding." Over the following days, they worked carefully to secure their position, creating multiple copies of every document, arranging discreet protection for Mrs. Bellamy and Gerald Finch as they traveled toward the hearing, and quietly informing the regional magistrate of the serious nature of the evidence they intended to present, without revealing every detail prematurely. As the day of the hearing finally arrived, tension hung thick over both Ashcombe Manor and Voss House, each household aware that whatever occurred within the magistrate's chambers that day would determine not only the fate of two families' long-buried grievances, but potentially the safety of everyone who had bravely chosen to speak against a man who had spent a decade ensuring his secrets remained buried beneath layers of careful deception and quiet intimidation. The regional magistrates' hall filled steadily that morning, word having spread through the county that something unusual was scheduled for the day's proceedings, drawing considerably more spectators than the usual routine matters typically attracted. Adrian and Serafina arrived together, having agreed it would strengthen their case to present a unified front rather than approaching the matter separately. Mrs. Bellamy arrived shortly after, accompanied by Edmund, who had personally overseen her safe transport, given the very real concerns about potential interference. Gerald Finch arrived last, visibly nervous but resolute, having traveled from his temporary refuge specifically for this occasion, understanding the risk involved but choosing courage over continued silence. Lord Reyes arrived as well, having received word of the hearing's true purpose only the previous evening, too late to arrange anything beyond his presence and whatever influence he could exert directly within the chambers themselves. His expression remained carefully composed, though Serafina noticed his eyes darting occasionally toward the entrance, as though calculating some final strategy even as the proceedings began. The magistrate, an elderly man named Percival Ainsworth, known throughout the county for his careful, deliberate approach to matters of significant complexity, called the hearing to order, his gaze sweeping across the unusually crowded chamber with evident curiosity. "I understand this matter concerns serious allegations regarding financial fraud spanning multiple families across our county," Ainsworth began. "Duke Colebrook, Duchess Voss, you have requested this hearing. Please proceed with your evidence." Adrian rose first, his voice steady, despite the weight of the moment. "Your Honor, 10 years ago, the Voss family suffered a devastating financial collapse, long attributed entirely to business dealings gone wrong with my own family. Recent investigation has revealed this account to be incomplete, and I stand here today to present evidence that a third party, Lord Callum Reyes, orchestrated deliberate fraud against the Voss family, and subsequently, against at least one other family within this county." Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd as Reyes's expression tightened, though he remained silent, waiting to see exactly how much evidence they intended to present before mounting whatever defense he had managed to prepare. Serafina rose next, presenting the documentation retrieved from her father's journal and Gerald Finch's preserved files, describing carefully the pattern of fraudulent investment schemes that had led to her family's ruin, and connecting each piece of evidence back to Reyes's direct involvement. "My father suspected deliberate deception in the months before our collapse," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. "He confronted Lord Reyes directly, and shortly afterward, our family's fortune collapsed entirely. This journal, preserved among his private papers, documents his suspicions in detail." Ainsworth examined the journal carefully, his expression growing increasingly serious as he reviewed the entries Serafina indicated. "This is compelling, Duchess, though a private journal alone cannot serve as conclusive proof of deliberate fraud, which is why we have additional testimony to present," Adrian said, gesturing toward Gerald Finch, who rose slowly, visibly nervous but determined, as he approached to address the magistrate directly. Finch described his role as the Voss family's legal counsel during those critical years, his growing suspicions about Reyes's business dealings, and the direct threats he had received afterward. Threats that had silenced him for a full decade, until finally choosing to speak the truth, despite the personal risk involved. Lord Reyes made it clear that pursuing these suspicions further would prove professionally devastating, Finch said. "I chose silence over risk, a choice I have regretted every day since, particularly given how much the Voss family suffered as a result of my continued silence." Reyes finally rose, his expression carefully controlled despite the mounting evidence against him. "Your Honor, these accusations rest entirely on decade-old speculation and a private journal that proves nothing beyond one man's suspicions that were never substantiated at the time and remain unsubstantiated now. Mr. Finch's testimony, while emotionally compelling, offers no concrete evidence beyond his own recollection that may well be colored by years of guilt over his own perceived failures rather than genuine memory of events that occurred a decade ago." "There is more evidence, Your Honor," Serafina said firmly, unwilling to allow Reyes's careful deflection to undermine their momentum. "Mrs. Bellamy, would you please share your family's experience with the court?" Mrs. Bellamy rose, her voice trembling slightly, but growing steadier, as she described her husband's business partnership with Reyes, years after the Voss family's collapse. The eerily similar pattern of growing suspicions, followed by devastating financial ruin, and her husband's death, still troubled by circumstances he never fully understood. "This is a pattern, Your Honor," Adrian said firmly, once Mrs. Bellamy finished her testimony. "Two families, years apart, suffering nearly identical circumstances, both connected directly to Lord Reyes's business dealings. This is not coincidence, and it is not merely the recollection of grieving, guilt-ridden individuals seeking someone to blame for their misfortune. This is a clear, documented pattern of deliberate fraud spanning at least a decade." The chamber fell into tense silence as Ainsworth considered the mounting evidence before him, his expression grave, as he weighed the seriousness of the accusations against the reputation and influence Reyes had built over the years. Reyes, sensing the tide turning increasingly against him, made one final attempt at deflection. "Your Honor, I would remind the court that the Duke of Ashcombe and Duchess Voss have formed an unusual alliance in recent weeks, one that some might suggest carries personal motivations beyond genuine pursuit of justice. Rumors have already circulated regarding the true nature of their partnership, rumors that suggest this entire proceeding may serve interests other than the truth this court claims to seek." A murmur of uncertainty rippled through the crowd, and for a moment, Adrian feared this final deflection might successfully cast enough doubt to undermine everything they had worked so carefully to present. But before he could respond, an unexpected voice rose from among the spectators. "Your Honor, if I may address the court." Every head turned as Oliver Bennett stepped forward from among the crowd, his expression nervous but resolute as he approached to stand alongside Adrian and Serafina. "I have served within Lord Reyes's household for the past 3 years. I have personally witnessed conversations between Lord Reyes and his associate, discussing plans to interfere with this very hearing, to ensure the evidence presented here today never reached this court's attention. I can testify to this directly, under whatever oath this court requires." Reyes's composure finally cracked visibly, his face paling as he realized the full scope of what had just occurred. "This is preposterous," he said sharply. "This young man clearly seeks some personal advantage by fabricating these claims. I seek nothing beyond finally speaking the truth I have suppressed for far too long," Oliver said firmly, meeting Reyes's furious gaze without flinching. "My own family suffered under circumstances I now recognize as remarkably similar to what has been described here today, though on a smaller scale, that never drew this kind of attention. I have watched Lord Reyes build his fortune and reputation upon a foundation of careful deception for years, and I can no longer remain silent while others continue to suffer the consequences of that deception." Ainsworth's expression had grown increasingly severe throughout this final testimony, and he raised his hand for silence as the chamber erupted into renewed murmuring. "This court has heard sufficient evidence to warrant formal investigation into these allegations. Lord Reyes, given the serious nature of these accusations, and the testimony suggesting active interference with these very proceedings, I am ordering an immediate formal inquiry into your business dealings over the past decade, including full access to your financial records and correspondence." Reyes's face had gone entirely pale now, the careful composure he had maintained throughout the hearing finally crumbling under the weight of evidence and testimony that had proven far more comprehensive than he had anticipated. "Your Honor, this is an outrage. I have built my reputation through years of legitimate business success." "Then a thorough investigation should confirm exactly that, Lord Reyes," Ainsworth said firmly. "And if your reputation truly rests on legitimate foundations, you have nothing to fear from this inquiry. However, given the evidence presented today, I cannot in good conscience dismiss these serious allegations without proper investigation." As guards moved forward at the magistrate's signal to escort Reyes from the chamber, pending further investigation, his eyes swept across the room one final time, settling briefly on Adrian and Serafina with an expression of pure, undisguised fury, before he was led away, his carefully constructed decade of deception finally beginning to unravel before the very authorities he had spent years successfully avoiding. The chamber slowly emptied afterward, spectators buzzing with excited conversation about the dramatic proceedings they had just witnessed. Mrs. Bellamy embraced Serafina warmly before departing, tears of relief and vindication finally flowing after years of silent suffering. Gerald Finch shook Adrian's hand firmly, his earlier nervousness replaced by quiet pride at finally choosing courage over continued silence. Oliver Bennett lingered near the doorway, uncertain of his welcome given his sudden, unexpected intervention. Adrian approached him directly, extending his hand in genuine gratitude. "Mr. Bennett, your courage today may well have secured justice that would otherwise have remained buried indefinitely. I am deeply grateful for your willingness to speak, particularly given the personal risk involved. I could not remain silent while watching the same pattern of deception continue to harm others," Oliver said simply. "I only regret not finding this courage sooner." As they finally departed the magistrate's hall together, Adrian and Serafina walked side by side into the bright afternoon sunlight, the weight of 10 years of buried injustice finally beginning to lift from both their shoulders. though neither yet fully understood how dramatically this hearing's outcome would reshape not only their families' futures, but the unexpected bond that had formed between them throughout this dangerous, difficult pursuit of long-overdue truth. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the formal inquiry into Lord Reyes's business dealings proceeded swiftly, uncovering a decade of carefully concealed fraud that extended well beyond even what Adrian and Serafina had managed to piece together. Additional victims came forward once news of the investigation spread, each one adding further weight to the case against him, until the full scope of his deception became impossible for anyone to deny or dismiss. The Voss family's original ruin was formally acknowledged as the result of deliberate fraud rather than any failure or wrongdoing on the part of the Colebrook family, restoring not just their fortune through legal restitution, but their standing and dignity within the county after a decade of misplaced blame. The Bellamy family received similar acknowledgement and restitution, as did several other families whose quieter suffering had never previously connected to the same underlying cause. Gerald Finch, freed finally from the guilt and fear that had shadowed him for 10 years, returned to his village and resumed his quiet retirement, though now with the peace of mind that comes from finally choosing honesty over continued silence. Oliver Bennett, his courage recognized throughout the county, found new employment within Ashcombe Manor's household staff, offered by Adrian himself in gratitude for his crucial testimony. Serafina's brother, Nathaniel, initially skeptical of his sister's alliance with Adrian, gradually came to understand the genuine partnership that had formed between them, one built not on manipulation or personal ambition, but on shared pursuit of justice that had ultimately benefited both their families equally. As autumn settled over the county, bringing golden leaves and cooler evenings, Ashcombe Manor prepared to host another grand gathering, this one considerably less tense than the ball that had first brought Adrian and Serafina together in dramatic confrontation months earlier. This time, the invitation carried a different purpose entirely, a celebration of restored fortunes and cleared reputations, attended by many of the same guests who had witnessed that first fateful encounter. Serafina arrived that evening in a gown of deep emerald, her bearing considerably lighter than it had been in months. The weight of a decade's misplaced anger finally lifted from her shoulders. Adrian greeted her at the entrance, his expression warm with genuine affection that had grown steadily throughout their shared pursuit of truth. "You look radiant this evening," he said, offering his arm as they entered the grand hall together. "I feel considerably lighter than I have in years," Serafina admitted, accepting his arm with an ease that would have seemed impossible months earlier. 10 years of anger, finally set down properly, replaced with something considerably more useful. "And what might that be?" Adrian asked, guiding her toward the center of the hall, where guests had already begun gathering, the orchestra tuning their instruments in preparation for the evening's festivities. "Gratitude," Serafina said simply, "for a man who chose to seek truth rather than simply defend his family's reputation, even when doing so meant uncovering uncomfortable questions about his own father's past." They paused near the center of the hall, the same spot where months earlier she had demanded he bow before the assembled crowd, an act meant to humiliate that had instead marked the beginning of an unlikely partnership neither of them could have anticipated at the time. "Duke Colebrook," Serafina said, her voice carrying just enough for nearby guests to notice, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth as she recalled that fateful first encounter. "Duchess Voss," Adrian replied, matching her tone, curiosity evident in his expression as he wondered what she intended. Without further preamble, Serafina lowered herself into a graceful, deliberate bow, considerably lower than protocol required, the same gesture she had once demanded from him under entirely different circumstances. The surrounding guests fell into surprised silence, watching this unexpected reversal with evident fascination. "This time," she said, straightening slowly, "I offer this gesture freely, not as command, but as genuine respect for a man who proved himself considerably more honorable than the reputation I once assigned him." Adrian's expression softened with quiet emotion as he stepped forward, taking her hands gently in his own. "Then allow me to respond as I did before," he said, lifting her gently, though this time the gesture carried none of the earlier tension, only warmth and genuine affection shared openly before the assembled guests. "Not to defy you," he continued, "but to stand alongside you, as equals, who have earned each other's respect through difficult, dangerous pursuit of truth neither of us could have accomplished alone. The hall erupted into warm applause, considerably different from the nervous, scattered response that had followed their first dance months earlier. This time, genuine joy filled the room, guests delighted by the transformation they had witnessed unfold over recent weeks. From bitter rivalry born of decade-old misunderstanding into genuine partnership built on shared courage and mutual respect. The orchestra began playing once more, and Adrian led Serafina into a slow, graceful dance, their movements considerably more comfortable and natural than during their first tense encounter, each step reflecting the trust and understanding they had built together throughout their dangerous pursuit of justice. "Do you realize," Serafina said quietly as they danced, "that everything between us began with an insult I intended to humiliate you, and yet somehow led to this moment instead?" "Life rarely follows the path we expect," Adrian replied, smiling gently. "Sometimes our greatest challenges lead us toward outcomes far better than anything we could have originally imagined." "And what outcome do you imagine now, Your Grace?" Serafina asked, her eyes searching his with genuine curiosity. Adrian considered the question carefully before answering, his expression thoughtful yet certain. "I imagine a partnership built on the same courage and honesty that brought us together, one that continues long beyond tonight's celebration, regardless of whatever challenges the future might bring." Serafina's smile deepened, genuine warmth replacing the guarded caution that had once defined every interaction between them. "I believe I would welcome exactly that outcome, Duke Colebrook." As their dance continued, surrounded by guests who had witnessed the remarkable transformation of their relationship from bitter confrontation to genuine partnership, neither Adrian nor Serafina needed further words to understand that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, bound not by the old grievances that had once separated their families, but by the shared courage and mutual respect they had earned through months of dangerous, determined pursuit of long-overdue justice. Outside the grand hall, autumn leaves drifted gently across the manor's gardens, carried by a cool evening breeze that promised the arrival of winter, though within the warmly lit ballroom, surrounded by music, laughter, and the genuine joy of restored fortunes and cleared reputations, neither Adrian nor Serafina spared a thought for the changing seasons, content instead in the certainty that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would meet them together, as true equals, who had proven themselves worthy of each other's trust and respect through the most difficult trial either of their families had ever faced. And so, the story that began with a demand for humiliation ended instead with genuine celebration, a testament to the unexpected paths that courage, honesty, and the relentless pursuit of truth can sometimes carve through even the deepest wells of misunderstanding and old, misplaced anger, leaving behind not bitterness, but the foundation for something considerably stronger and more lasting than either of them could have imagined, on that fateful night when a duchess demanded a bow, and a duke lifted her up instead, stunning the entire hall.